Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our 297th gathering of the monthly Roundtable. I started these after 9/11 to provide us with an opportunity to get together until April 2020. We met in person at John Jay College. Since then, we've been meeting online. These monthly gatherings are co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College and truly welcome all of you this morning and glad that you were all able to get your emails changing our location from one email account to another. A technological glitch. It was inevitable. It was going to happen, but I'm glad that technology allows us to switch over as quickly as we were able to do this. We are so delighted each month to have a wonderful committee of colleagues who put these events together, including Matthew Latimer, Nikki Borofsky, Sherston Pugh, Chloe Choi, and Alex Yaroslavsky. These sessions are recorded. The recordings are posted on our YouTube account. Nikki, can you put that in the chat? As well as the websites for ACR-GNY and the CUNY Dispute Resolution Center. I am so delighted this morning to have with us Geraldine Downey. Each month we're so pleased to have colleagues who are able to share their research, their work, their insights, and make this possible for us. To introduce Geraldine, I'm going to turn it over to Nikki Borofsky. Take it away, Nikki.
Thank you so much. And it really is a pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Geraldine Downey. She really fits beautifully into our speakers who are illustrious, esteemed, innovative, cross-cutting, bridge-building, barrier-breaking academics, practitioners, and system changers from New York City and beyond. Professor Downey is the Robert Johnston Niven Professor of Humane Letters and Psychology at Columbia University and the founder and director of the Columbia Center for Justice. Over the course of more than 3 decades, she has become internationally recognized for research on identity development, social exclusion, and interpersonal aggression. This is work that has really profoundly shaped how scholars and practitioners, mediators, conflict resolvers understand the dynamics of human relationships and conflict. Many of us know her for developing the concept of rejection sensitivity, the idea that repeated experiences of exclusion or disrespect shape how people interpret social interactions and how strongly they perceive to perceived slights. And we all know the power of perception in this business. For mediators, restorative practitioners, educators, organizers, policymakers, and others in this roundtable community, students as well, and people that are curious, I want to include as well, this insight may seem immediately familiar. Much of conflict escalation is not simply about what happened, but how people experience belonging, dignity, and recognition in their relationships and communities. What makes Professor Downey's work really compelling is the way her scholarship moves across domains. Her research bridges social psychology with lived realities and communities experiencing violence and marginalization, and shows how insights about identity and belonging and exclusion can inform practical approaches to conflict prevention and community healing. Really important these days. The cross-cutting perspective is reflected in the project Restore, which she's going to speak about today. It's a community violence intervention working with young people at high risk of violence who hold influence with rival street crews. I lived in Bedford-Stuyvesant for a while and really appreciate the work that she has done. It combines messengers that are credible with lived experience and restorative justice-based healing circles, mentorship, life development skills, education, employment pathways, a really comprehensive strategy to make deep change. As she's sharing the thinking and innovations and insights behind this model, we can really take lessons from what she's sharing and implement it, hopefully, and have it inform what we do in our daily lives. For those of us working across mediation, community dialogue, restorative justice, this conversation is going to be bigger about belonging, dignity, identity, and all of the conditions that allow us and allow conflict systems to shift towards healing and constructive leadership. I think there's a need for more constructive leadership in the world these days. We are very fortunate to have somebody who works at the intersection of psychology, human relationships, and community peace building. Please join me in welcoming Professor Geraldine Downey. Thank you, Professor, for being here.
Thank you. So I'm really delighted to be here. I came here to this event through my connections with the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Masters at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. So thank you, Kirsten. But what I would sort of want to give you a little bit of background about myself and about the Center for Justice. So the Center for Justice grew out of the work that I had the privilege of doing with Kathy Boudin and Cheryl Wilkins when I was teaching at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. And they were two of the women who brought back college to Bedford Hills. And after it had been removed, when Pell Grant, when people who were incarcerated became ineligible for Pell Grants in the middle of the 90s. And so when they came home from incarceration, we worked together to found the Center for Justice. And our commitment was to end mass incarceration and mass criminalization. And what we were, our goal was to do that through education, through research, through policy change, and really using Columbia as a platform to bring about innovation in the criminal justice center or the criminal justice system, and shifted from being focused on punishment and retribution to being focused on healing and prevention. So to cut a very long story short, this is the work that we do, and I'm glad to see our colleague from the School of Social Work, Jenny Crawford, here, because she's been one of the people who've worked with us in our work and been supportive of the work at the centre. My own background, as you may have gathered, is I'm Irish. I grew up sorry, during the Troubles, and I became very interested in what could bring about peace in Northern Ireland. And so I used to travel up there because I met a friend, one of my best friends, in the first day I went to college, who was from Northern Ireland. And what I was able to see, and this was during the 70s, is that there was the sectarian troubles, that people lived at one side of a wall, and if they were Catholic and if they were Protestant, they lived at the other side of the same wall. And one of the things that I went up there in the 90s when things were starting to settle down, and I was able to see what happened, a number of the things that contributed to peace in Northern Ireland, or to a movement towards peace. And two of them were education of the people who were from the both sides, who were incarcerated. And so Open University came into the prisons in Northern Ireland and brought in education. And when the peace process happened, it was because people who were incarcerated and had gotten education that they never would have gotten outside of prison, were willing to sort of move beyond using violence to bring about a solution to the problems in Northern Ireland. The other thing was that the British and American and Irish governments and the European Union invested in the communities. They gave them the opportunity and encouragement to develop their own sense of political engagement. I remember going up to the Falls Road in the 90s, and so to a community centre that is called the Culturlan, and it was funded by the British government, but with the investment in Irish culture. And there was a similar community centre at the other side of the wall for people who were more oriented towards the unionist view of how to solve the problem in Northern Ireland. So this kind of experience stuck with me. I also, in my youth, was the manager of a soccer team. And for some people, the success of the under-13 soccer team and they're now in their 60s, was the greatest achievement of their life. So what I knew, I'm going to kind of get into Project Restore, but this is kind of the background to it, is that it's really important to invest in people who are on both sides of a conflict, to give them the kind of support that they need to develop. So this is kind of the training you do as a soccer team manager before you send them out and tell them to actually win a game in that case. But it's the investment in individuals that are in individual sides of a conflict. And I'm talking to you about something that you know very well. So I'm going to shift now to talking about Project Restore and how that came about. And I'm going to try and share my screen, and hopefully the technical difficulties that, what's this, Project Restore, share. Okay. Is this happening? Maybe it's just a second. Stop share.
It worked before, so you'll be fine.
Oh, no, it'll work, but I just want to make sure that application window. Can you see?
No, it's just a sliver of the
Okay,
PowerPoint screen.
Again. Okay. Interview.
Yes.
No,
There we go.
much better, yeah.
Actually, this wasn't use slideshow. This is what. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me just tell you about the background to Project Restore. It's a community violence intervention and prevention model. And it grew out of a program that we have at Columbia called Justice Ambassadors. And this was founded by, how do I move this along? Oops. This was founded by Geraldine Downey, who normally, if I could persuade him, would come along and do do this talk with me. But he is a graduate student now at NYU and has other demands on his time. But I'd met Gerald when I was teaching a course, co-teaching a course with Lucy Lang, who's now the Inspector General at Queensborough Correctional Facility. And Lucy she was at that time working with the Manhattan DA's office, and she approached me and said, I would like to teach a course in Queensborough Correctional Facility where half the students are prosecutors and half the students are people who are coming to the end of an incarceration sentence. They're on their way home, because that's what Queensborough Correctional Facility is. So I said, yeah, I teach in the prison, and I have a sort of a course that I know works, and I teach the same course at Columbia, and the students, many of whom go on to become lawyers, it works for them too. So we put together this course, and the student in that very first course was Gerald Daniels, and Gerald was coming to the end of a 6-year sentence that he began when he was aged 18. And he had been, he's from the Bronx, and the sentence, he ended up in prison because of gang conspiracy charges. And when he came home from incarceration, he spent 2 weeks in the course, came home, would actually come back into the prison every week to finish it. And he ended up, or he joined us at Columbia, but with this idea and that he was able to implement to do something that's similar to what we call inside criminal justice, but that would bring young people together with from the most marginalized neighborhoods in the city, with city officials from not just from the prosecutor's office, but from all the different people in agencies that had power over young people in New York. And so that's been going on for about 7 years now. It's been very, very successful. In the second cohort, Jarrell invited the prosecutor in his case, Nigel Farina, who was then the chief of gang prosecution at the Special Narcotics Prosecutor's Office, to join just as ambassadors. And together they came up with the idea of Project Restore, which was a different way of dealing with the sort of the problem of gang violence, and than Nigel was used to using. And what was the approach at that time was to identify young people who were involved in gangs and follow them for a couple of years until there was enough to make an indictment. And so basically what Jarrell's idea was that if you know who's going to be indicted in 2 years, why don't you put the effort into preventing or into helping young people, and they're mainly between 18 and 24, to turn their lives around. So invest in them so that they have other opportunities than the ones they fear, which is and want to avoid, which is going to prison or being or dying. And so the guiding question in the design of Project Restore was what combination of supports and opportunities and networks would enable young people from the neighborhoods that have the highest level of violence in the city to transition into healthy adulthood. And so the design of Project Restore and the intention of it was to engage young people deemed at high risk into what we called a work development program. We didn't tell them this was or we didn't emphasize that we want you to leave gang life and stop committing crime. Instead, we said this is an opportunity for you to turn your lives around. And so it was it's an intensive 12-month community violence intervention program. It was designed to engage 30 young people from rival street crews. And initially, and this is kind of the important part that goes back to like building your team before you send them out to, well, in this case, engage in peaceful interactions across groups. That the programming that we developed was delivered in separate neutral locations. And what the background to how that was sort of possible and what led to Project Restore being able to be implemented was a community university government partnership. So Jarrell and Nigel Farina and myself went around to the various different district attorneys' offices in New York City and said, we have this idea. Would you be interested in implementing this idea to intervene with young people before you have enough information to indict them and provide them with an opportunity to turn their lives around. So Meg Reese, who had been a participant in Justice Ambassadors, was the chief of, I think, social policy at the time in the Brooklyn DA's office. And she introduced the concept to the DA's office. She said, we're looking for something different to do. The DA does not want, because he comes from the community himself, he does not want to be doing gang indictments as the only tool in his toolbox. And so what the DA Gonzalez was very heard about the program, and he committed to putting his I would say his heft behind getting this working. Meg persuaded the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice to invest in the project, and we got it going after an indictment, after a very unfortunate indictment in Bed-Stuy. And the idea was that what tends to happen after a gang indictment is that the leadership is taken off the street, and and this is a term that Nigel uses, the junior varsity team then take their place. And what Project Restore was intended to do was to give the younger people the opportunity to do something different. And so I'm going to kind of go through what are the components of Project Restore, and then to tell you a little bit about why we picked each component. But what's really important is that this was a community university government partnership, and the DA's office wanted this program to be community centered, and the funding was intended to go into the community, not into the DA's office. And so a big part of what preceded Project Restore was the engagement of the community in defining what they wanted for their young people, and in investing, getting a community-based organization to be the place where the program was centered. So what every part of the program was really important and essential. And so I have the biggest what brought participants in the door, and was the fact that they would receive 25 hours or $25 an hour for program activity for 20 hours a week. So for many of them, this was their first opportunity, or the first time to hear about an opportunity where they would actually get paid a fairly dignified wage for their time, and that would allow them to say no to the street activities that they were engaging in to make ends meet. And so it sort of recognized that their time was important, and that they and it gave them sort of a cushion to avoid risk. As somebody described it, this was a peaceful pay cut. They were willing to make less money in order to have a peaceful existence. The other part was that there was intensive case management and mentorship by people who, many of whom had, or most of whom had lived experience. People from the same communities, many of them who had been incarcerated, who were committed to making sort of progress in their own lives. And I'm not going to talk about it today, but what I should say is that for all of the staff who were engaged in the program, made significant strides in their own lives. Either they went back to education, they got like bigger and better jobs that were better paying than they had. So that was also a kind of they were selected and encouraged to do this because this was something where they could show a path to change to the participants. the other part was sort of life skills, and this was really based on justice ambassadors. So it was providing young people with the opportunity for practical training. They learned about financial literacy. They learned about how to use how to interact with the police in ways that didn't get them arrested. And they learned about, how gangs, they talked a lot about how gangs initially developed in communities for very, very positive reasons, like the Crips and the Bloods, that they were the community vanguard, and that this kind of went back to what the Black Panthers had done in the 60s and 70s, that they were motivated to be positive for their community. So we never in the program suggested that they drop their friends and that they sort of exit from gang life. Really the focus was on supporting transformation in what their friendship groups, which is effectively what the street crews they were part of, were, what they did with their lives. There was they were offered an internship where they worked for 10 hours a week, and this helped provide a structure to their day. This was a paid work experience, and they learned sort of skills, and they developed an identity and were recognized in their community as workers. And so, as one person said, one of the guys said, the older people who would walk away from us in the past now see us going to work every morning, and they say hello to us and encourage us to continue what we're doing. And I've left sort of the inside circle part for last, because this was a trauma-informed healing circle that was offered to participants every week, with the idea that it would both sort of it would help them deal with the trauma that they experienced and didn't sort of recognize as anything other than normal daily life in their communities in Bed-Stuy. It helped them recognize sort of the emotions that they were experiencing. And I would say that, after the program occurred in 2023, and we've been following up the participants and still engaging with them until today. What they learned was the ability to self-regulate. So not to be just at the whim of what's going on in their life, in their community around them, but to actually make active choices, and to be able to do that in their own lives. And so this inside circle, it's a sort of an extraordinary group of men who came together when they were incarcerated, most of them on life sentences in Folsom Prison. And there was a lot, and this is as you know, in California, where there's an awful lot of gang activity in the prison. So basically, if you go in to a prison there, you have to you have to pick a gang to be part of. And so what they did was they worked together to end violent conflict in Folsom Prison through this kind of healing circle approach. And Jarrell got in contact with them through the Annie Casey Foundation, because they were working in New Jersey in prisons, or juvenile prisons there, and he went in and worked with them for a weekend. And so I'm kind of going on about them because it was really difficult to persuade the people with the funding in the city that we needed to bring in, or that the city would benefit from bringing in people who had experience working with gangs, as opposed to doing the kind of healing circles that's more individual based. But if we were to say that the participants, the graduates of the program, identified anything that changed their lives, that what they did identify being in these healing circles, which happened every Saturday with each one group in the morning and the other in the afternoon, where they sat around in a circle for the first time and saw men being vulnerable with one another, and talking about and had the opportunity to talk about the challenges in their own life and what they hadn't processed. And so that's not the language that they would use, but basically they learned their triggers, they learned how to become their individual selves rather than at the whim of whatever was going on in their community or in their crew. And so this was a truly sort of important part of what was, in a sense, initially sold to them as a work development program. But I would say about the DA's office and that they had a sort of, I wouldn't say quite a hands-off approach, but they were that once the program was started, they facilitated and helped as much as possible, but this was not something that they oversaw or engaged in on a day-to-day basis. They showed up for celebratory events, and one of the things that was particularly important was having these, every so often having events that celebrated what the participants, their accomplishments. And so I'll tell you why that's important a little bit later. But this is what the program looked like. And I'm not going to go into this, but it's a sort of a very different approach than being punitive and reactive. And the idea is to address the root causes by building social capital, meeting unmet needs, and especially I'm going to come back and highlight this: strengthening pro-social networks and creating pathways to opportunity. And so I just wanted to sort of say that the participants, the 30 participants that we engaged, had that we got them to engage through community connections. So there was one young person who was connected with the executive director of the program, Dr. Unique Starks. They'd met when she was a social worker in Brownsville, and this young person had been, at 15, he'd been sent to a program. And so that kind of positive connection that she built with him at that point was a basis for getting one of these groups in, because he was very influential. The other group was there was a community member, Coco Previs, who knew everybody on both sides of this conflict. And she and Gerald Daniels went around to the housing project and asked people if they were interested. And one of the people that she had worked with for a long time was very helpful in getting, because he trusted her, in getting people to engage. So it's not just the money that's important, the buy-in of the sort of older people in the community, but how do you get young people who have every reason to mistrust everything that's going on in their lives? How do you get them to come in? And that was how we did it. And they, so that's kind of the process of recruitment. What we were interested in, and I have to give Eric Gonzalez a lot of credit for this. He was willing to work with people who would have been recognized as at that sort of highest risk for violence, and to provide them with something different. Initially, he wasn't convinced, or he wasn't, I suppose, he didn't overestimate the potential impact of this program. He said, if we keep a few people out of prison, then it'll be a success. And so about 90% of the 30 people were crew involved, and I would say the crew affiliated. I'd say 90% because I don't want to be labeling them all as crew involved. 90% had a family member who was incarcerated. So they knew far more people who were in prison than were in college. And when they entered, one person had a job, part-time job as an Uber driver. Everybody else of the 30 was disconnected from education or from employment. And for many of them, maybe about a third, this was the first legal job that they had in their internship. 33% had been previously incarcerated themselves or juvenile facilities, and 73% had been shot at. They all knew people who had died, they all knew people who had been shot at, and most of them, as I said, had been shot at themselves. So the kind of model, and I'm not going to go into this sort of very much, but I'm a big fan of Uri Bronfenbrenner, as is everybody who's ever taken any course from me. But really, this kind of recognition that what we have with in communities where there's very high rates of community violence is factors that are operating at each level of the ecological system. So, and I just kind of want to highlight two parts. So there's the macro system level, the policies and that are in place for dealing with young people in disadvantaged communities, and these policies. And this is kind of comes back to my kind of rejection sensitivity work. They're policies of rejection. And so what happens is young people get involved with the criminal justice system early and often. And that limits what they can do for the rest of their lives in ways that are maybe intended or ways that are not intended. And so for us, it was really important to have in terms of the ecosystem of support that we created in Project Restore, to have people who were in the positions of power and who would work with our young people. But by that I mean would invite them to come and talk about Project Restore to the City Council, to state addresses. Like Jumami Williams brought one of the graduates to talk at his state of the Public Advocate's Office, and this was seen on television, and the other young people who were in the Project Restore. What they took from that was, it was really great to see somebody like us, somebody we know, J-Rock is his name, on television for something good, because normally when we see people on television, one of us on television, it's that he's going to jail. So this kind of gave us hope for the future. So this sort of involvement and commitment from people in a position to make decisions, people in power, and their commitment to involving participants in powerful places, and it was really, really important. The other thing that was important is that when young people get involved with the criminal justice system, and especially get a felony conviction, it's very hard for them to get work. And so, we worked with some of them who, like one young man who was 21 said, I have a felony conviction, I'll never get a job. And so it's very hard to get jobs because you have to go through all sorts of background checks, but also the sense that it's impossible is going to prevent people from even trying. So we had to kind of work around or get people to change their perspective on what was possible for them, and then to change employers' perspective or educational institutions' perspective on what was possible with these young people. So basically, I'm not going to go through this, but what the idea that underlies Project Restore, and is that the young people that we were working with were really in an environment of rejection. Things were not going well for the most part in their homes. They were disconnected. They were connected to their peer group, but their peer group was disconnected from school, from anything positive in the community, and from employment. And the community distrusted them. As you know, one of the participants said, you know, before Project Restore, when people wouldn't get into the elevator with us in our housing developments, and now they reach out to us and ask us to get their kids involved in our programs. And again, this is just, I really kind of want to echo this again, because at the macro system level, there's the kind of concern that employers or schools have about the dangers or the risks that people from who ended up in Project Restore brought into their organizations. It really actually increases risk rather than decreases risk. So one of the kind of, you know, the ways in one of the most telling sort of experiences that that our participants shared with us was that when they, and I'm going to kind of get to this eventually, but that when the two groups came together for the first time, when leaders of the two groups, and this was after we'd worked with them for about 9 months, they wanted to meet in somewhere important. So they wanted to come to the mayor's office. And when they arrived to the mayor's office, to the building, the state building, or the city building downtown, the security guards pointed them to, oh, the court is on the 5th floor, and they said, oh no, we're actually going to the mayor's office of criminal justice. But they experienced this kind of rejection and, you know, sense that they weren't welcome at the point of entry. Being from Colombia, which has shut its gates to the general public, this is something that they have experienced at Columbia as well, as when they come to visit us. So putting barriers, physical barriers in place to solve one problem actually can create other problems and can create the sense of rejection or exclusion.
Professor, there was a question about the role of women and girls in the project. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So the gang violence, it tends to be young men. And when we started the program, we focused on young men. There are other programs that are now sort of in place, or that we're starting to develop, that my colleague in Dr. Unique is starting with young women. And so that was, in a sense, a deliberate decision at the beginning, not because they were not involved in the same way, young women in gangs. So that's the reason, not that we didn't want to work with women. And so what we wanted to do was to sort of create a sense of acceptance at all these different levels. So we made a commitment. So the involvement in the program was voluntary, and we made a commitment not to reject or eject people from the program, to find a way for them not to be dismissed because they didn't show up 3 times in a row. But and so it's not that we didn't have any accountability, but the door was always open. And we also wanted to sort of create a sense of just general support that went beyond the program staff. We connected them with a lot of different sort of opportunities and organizations and people. And one of the things that we, and I'll sort of get to that, is that when we they had they didn't have anybody to call on for support. That was one of the things that distinguished them, or they had very, very few. And the number of people that they could identify and as sources of support after the program ended, and they continued to work with us, increased by about tenfold. So they now knew that there were people that they could call up. And one of the things that was so important about that was that they started to call us staff, or started even to call the DA's office, or to come up to Columbia when they had a problem, rather than trying to fix it themselves in ways that might have been counterproductive. But this kind of creating an ecology of support was really important. And so I'm kind of getting into this, but really what transformed was this sense of what they talked about is that you kept at us, you were persistent. Even if we stopped coming, you'd call us up. And so we didn't, or you encouraged us to do things we didn't want to do at the beginning, like sign up for college. So it's kind of showing that I'm not alone. Partly through especially through Inside Circle, the people who had never kind of communicated even to themselves, but they started to talk. They initially, through hearing other people talking and recognizing, even if they didn't speak themselves in Inside Circle, that this person had the same experiences as me, and they were able to use words to describe those experiences. And then that ability to communicate did kind of involve everybody doing it in a better way. So this is sort of an example of, before PRB, I wasn't talking a lot. I like to talk, say what's on its mind. Now I don't hold anything back. And so there was this kind of sense of growth in openness and trust. And then what's probably really important, or maybe one of the most important changes that we saw over time, was the sense of identity discovery, that it's, and many of them have said this, I've never found myself before. I didn't know who I was. I'm finding myself. And so it's developing a kind of an authentic, like, personal identity within a supportive environment. So it's really thinking about who they want to be, how they want to show up for their community, for their family, what they want to do with their lives. And then, so this was sort of all going on for about 9 months before there was actually maybe we were working towards getting the leaders of the two crews to come together. So it's not that we were expecting them to be best friends ever, but and that did actually happen in some cases. But what we wanted them to do is actually be able to come together and sort of talk about, how they would develop a sort of principles of peaceful coexistence in their communities. And so we started to work. We initially, as I said, told them, like, they met separately. We pretended that we were just working with one group. I mean, I think that they kind of knew, but it was now but they started to say to us, well, we've changed, but this, you need to be working with the other group as well, because it's not enough for us to change. And then they kind of guessed, and we told them in the end that we were also working with the other group. But we began, and this was really the mentors who had themselves been gang involved, and especially Jarell and the Inside Circle team, began to talk to leaders, take them aside, and take them out to eat, and talk about what would it look like to get together? Do they think would be, given how much they had changed, how much they valued the things becoming like less heated, less violent in the neighborhood, what would it look like for them to talk to the others, to the other side, and over a kind of a period of about 2 to 3 months, 3 leaders on each side were kind of identified, or they identified themselves and said that they were willing to work together. And this was kind of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice event that I mentioned, where they were made to feel that they were actually coming to court by the staff who let people in through the metal detectors. They came together, and it took an awful lot of courage to do it, because everybody in there, not everybody, but a good number of people were saying, "I can't believe that you're doing this. It's very dangerous." And they came, and Inside Circle helped work, set up the meeting, and one of the most kind of interesting parts to it was that there was sort of one leader on each side, and they recognized how similar their perspectives were, because one said, if I was going to say something, the other person might have said it before me, and it's really what happened was they saw each other for the first time as individuals, and that really kind of broke the ice, and they agreed at the end of it to continue meeting. And out of that came what we call the Public Safety Working Group, where people from each side, and it was a small number of leaders, would come up to Colombia every week, and for the best part of a year, and learn to be the sort of leaders in their community, learn how to do Inside Circle, the healing circles, learn how to do facilitation training, learn how to do mentoring. So they became and identified themselves as the sort of next leaders of towards peace in their community. And it's, I do want to kind of come back to that, but it would not have been possible if there wasn't a financial stability, and there wasn't trusting relationships with the Project Restore staff. And if we hadn't had helped them get out of a lot of problems. So one of the sort of ways in which we worked very, very well with the DA's office was when a number of them got caught with guns, because during the program, but the DA's office, rather than immediately sending them to prison, which tends to happen in some of the other boroughs, they gave them an opportunity to invest more in Project Restore, and they got a set of things that they had to do, and we helped them do it. And all of them except one have only one person has been incarcerated, but others were able to overcome like what would have been like long sentences through their investment in Project Restore. And along the way, when they started to kind of make the decision to turn their lives around, what at these kind of turning points, what they identified is that they had something to lose now. And as one of them said, when I was in the cell after I'd been caught with a gun, and that happened after several of his friends had been shot, and he'd actually been shot at and seen somebody die in front of him. And so for protection, he'd used a gun, he got caught, he ended up in a cell. And he said, the only thing I was thinking about was I'm actually supposed to be up at Columbia doing facilitation. And, what are they going to think of me sitting here in a cell? So it's like he recognized then that he had changed what were his priorities. And so a lot of them talk about just how Project Restore and their investment in it. gave them something that they didn't want to risk losing. And that was what helped them make the kind of once they recognize that, make the commitment to contribute to the safety of their community and to get younger people involved in what was the expansion of Project Restore, and to work with them to not make the kind of same mistakes or get into the same situations as they had as young people. So the thing that I also sort of want to say, and I'm not going to go into this, but by the end of Project Restore, actually probably a little bit in the second year afterwards, about 7 of them who had never expected, or actually 10 of them who had never expected to go to college, signed up for college, and that this was a sort of a big change, and many of them, there's about 7 who are now sort of employed full-time as facilitators, as mentors, and all of them are also in college, or almost all of them. And so their identity shifted from being sort of like focused on survival strategies. They felt that they no longer had to be different people in different settings. They could be their authentic self, and that they were sort of assets to their community. They're good students. They're sought after by politicians and by policymakers in the city for their input. And so, and it's not, everybody didn't make the same sort of level of change, but there was a pathway that they saw to positive change, that where they would value themselves, and they would be valued members of their community. So what many of them kind of reported that was what was really important for them, was that they had improved self-regulation. They moved from a single response that was reactive to situations to having a lot of adaptive strategies to choose from, which Nigel, the prosecutor, would say about himself as well, that he had more tools in his toolbox. So what I want to sort of say about the community institutions, and at the change in the level of gun violence in the community, it actually, we weren't able to, this did not have a control group, but we were actually able to see if in the communities, the 2 precincts where the participants were from in Bed-Stuy, if compared to other precincts that were similar, if there was a reduction in gang violence. And this is kind of the 3rd year after the program began, and we found a significant decrease in shooting incidents that in the age group or 18 to 24, which accounts for most of the shootings. And so they as they kind of talked about it, and we hear this from the police, we hear this from the DA's office, it's the quietest the neighborhood has been in decades. And the reason for this is if everybody's too busy fixing their own life, there won't be no time for violence. That's kind of what that's a statement that kind of captures what many of them would say. And that it really did involve this kind of collaboration between participants, community members, and institutions around a shared goal of not just improving public safety, but of providing paths to healthy adulthood for the youth of their community. And so the DA's office organized a peaceful rally peace rally in the Barclay Center in December that brought together everybody that was involved in Project Restore. And what was really interesting was the 2 of the leaders from each of the crews went up to the DA and they had a conversation together about how something like this would never have happened with people involved in young people from all over Brooklyn, many of whom were involved in different street crews. They would not have come together to peacefully play basketball. And I think that this kind of was a recognition that this had happened, that things had changed, and that Project Restore was played a huge role in it. So this is kind of what I'm kind of going through this quickly, but what's still sort of going on in what made it so valuable or so I'm going to say courageous for the young people who came together to for that initial sit down, and was that they did face quite a lot of social backlash, and sort of felt, the threat of being ostracized, but they even though they came to the sit down and they brought friends in later into the public safety working group, there was still a lot of distrust and disease. So it's not like it's kind of like Northern Ireland. People might come to sit at a table, but they don't fully trust the other side. And while there was some positive really kind of friendships formed, there's still others who are very, what they say is that some of them will refuse to sit down with the other side because of the deaths that they've experienced. But others will say, I'm not there yet, but I don't have no ill will. And then others will say it's dope, but to be honest, it's being supported even by some of the guys that's still incarcerated. So I kind of want to talk about what's so important about the buy-in that we got. We got buy-in from the DA's office, from the NYPD, but we also worked with the people who are incarcerated, who'd been incarcerated for long times on indictments. And we worked both in Rikers with people who were there, and I also worked, and as did others, with the students that I teach inside in prison. And so, and many of them are from the same community. So the word got out that that Project Restore was something that was very important to people who are incarcerated for, in some cases, the rest of their lives, because that would improve the life chances of the young people in their communities, because they did not want to see them having the same lives as themselves. Let me just wanted to sort of end up with a quote that is from Wesley Jeffries, who was one of the leaders of who came to the sit down. He joined Project Restore a few months after he'd come home from a 6-year sentence, and he was particularly influential on his side. And what he said was, "This is a new thing I learned about street crews. You could turn that negative into a positive. It just takes some work. You give the group a different thing to look forward to. You've got to give them some light, some hope, show them a way, give them a little hope, give them a chance to dream again, because we all have dreams. It was just killed at an early age." So Wesley is now a student at Kingsborough College in Brooklyn, and he also works for We Build the Block as a full-time facilitator or mentor. And when we see him now, it's very often he's bringing some young person to the courtroom where we're going to support somebody, and supporting them to turn their lives around. So this is kind of like, where I want to stop with Project Restore. I just also want to say that the DA was able to take the results so far, and also I think he took Wesley and Jason Bostic, to talk to the City Council and to give them a sense of why this project is important, and got substantial funding to continue it for the next 3 years and to expand it to Brownsville, which is going to happen in the next couple of months. And the governor has given funding to its expansion into the Bronx, and we'll be working there with younger people. And so it's like I've talked about but mainly the work is done through kind of a team that is now is sort of housed at the Brooklyn DA's office. The executive director of the program and her senior manager were hired by the DA in Brooklyn to build out a restorative unit, where what they'll do is, in addition to expanding Project Restore, they will be working to use more restorative approaches to a number of to cases that they feel that the DA's office feels would benefit from this kind of approach. So we really see this kind of change in the approach from being punitive and retributive to being much more restorative and healing oriented. And this is kind of what we'd hoped for. I mean, I've left out all the pains of working across different organizations, bureaucracies like Columbia and the government, but I don't have to tell any of you who are on this call about the bureaucratic pains. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. We've had a bunch of questions that have come across.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed them all.
No. I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I thought now I'd invite the people who wrote the questions maybe to ask them in their own voice, if that would be preferable. If not, I can launch in and read you the questions. But I wanted to give the question posers the opportunity to raise their hand and ask the questions first, if that seems. Sergio, would you like to go first? Oh, and then Dr. Larry.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I want to ask, what did you think that was more hard to work with the different stakeholders in the city, like the police, like the media system, sometimes the newspaper, and which kind of attack these kinds of programs receive from the community and the people that they don't agree with these kinds of safety?
So it's interesting, we don't we do get that kind of pushback from especially some of the media like the New York Post, and when our young people put post on Instagram, they're actually very good users of social media. But when they post positive things, you get these comments, but we just kind of ignore them. And it's more like we talk directly, or not, and generally it's not me, to people in positions of power. The Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice has been doing a good job recently of getting that positive media attention. So it's not there are people who do not support this, but they're young people, and I think everybody appreciates them turning their lives around, so they can get behind that.
I'm sure that could be a whole nother session on dealing with those dynamics. Dr. Schooler, would you like to raise some of your questions?
Dr. Downey, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I was just asking in the chat about how you differentiate between the best roles for practitioners and scholars and practitioners with lived experience. In other words, what should the sort of outside scholar or outside practitioner do within the program as compared to people who have either been incarcerated, been involved in gangs, et cetera? How do you see the division of labor?
I mean, it's very interesting because and I think it kind of brings up a lot of kind of issues. And there is a quote that sticks in my head, which I'll come back to answering your question, but it's from an annual review of sociology chapter that Bruce Westron wrote with Matt Desmond, and they made the comment that a lot of people benefit get rich or earn their living off the poor, and so and that is something that I'm sort of always sort of attuned to. Because the Center for Justice is really committed to working in collaboration with people who've been directly impacted. And so about half our staff or more are people who are formerly incarcerated. So so that kind of keeps us, I suppose, real in our, keeps that to our mind. And so it can often be easier to pick the best student at Columbia to do something than it can be to work with somebody in the community who hasn't ever done Google Drive or whatever. But they also cannot go in and persuade people to take part in our programs. They know something different. And so it is, that's part of figuring that out, who can do what and who can actually collaborate together to do something. It's an investment of time and effort, just like, other kind of investments that we're willing to make. But that, I think, is and it's not, I think, bringing different skills and helping everybody build up their skills is the approach that we take. So that's a vague answer to your question. But did you have any thoughts?
Well, just to say, I mean, I think what's helpful about what you said is to not silo the people with lived experience just into the outreach role. That, there's no reason why someone less accustomed to some of the kind of, office work or, whatever you want to call it, project management can't be, schooled in that. And from my perspective as someone who's teaching in the prison right now, I certainly can't relate to people with justice involvement in a direct way from lived experience, but perhaps there are ways that I can, connect with them on some other level. So just to not be so rigid to say that lived experience is required in order to do recruitment and professional experience is required to do, project management and administration type work.
And I think that is something that we all have to keep in mind, that it's not that, especially, those of us who are educators, we're supposed to educate everybody, but that's, from teaching in the prison, I couldn't do, I've always had a co-teacher who's, I'm allowed to, or they're allowed to call themselves teaching fellows, but we work together to teach the course. It's not something that I would want to do myself. So.
Michael Wolf, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Geraldine, wonderful presentation. I actually have 3 questions. What do you think will be the future of this program? What do you think its applicability could be to places outside of Bedford-Stuyvesant? And how would you change the program if you could do so?
So I think that the program needs to be tailored for anywhere that it's introduced into. We are expanding it to Brownsville at the moment, and we've been working, and mainly the DA's Restorative Justice Unit has been working to develop the kind of relationships there, and have drawn on the Bed-Stuy participants who are connected to Brownsville, the Bed-Stuy graduates. I think you can't go in and say, we have this program and we'd like to impose it upon you. And so So it's really, it's for everywhere we go in. We are sort of partners, and with the idea that it's been tailored or changed in order to meet the needs of the community that we're going into. And that's where, it's not that we've gone into many, but we have, Jarell and I went to, mainly Jarell, was invited to Melbourne in Australia last, when did we go? In October, because they have a gang problem between some of the South Sudanese refugees and I don't know, it's with it and some other South or Sudanese groups, and they wanted to take elements of Project Restore. And when we went in to talk with the young people in the communities, in their housing developments, they could resonate with it. So, and similarly in the Bronx, they can resonate with it, because these kind of elements, will, in a sense, they work for any young person, and it comes from lived experience. So that's kind of like one thing. It's basically you have to tailor it, and I think it can be replicated. The other question you had was, what would we change? I mean, I think the biggest problem that we've had is not getting young people involved or engaged, but actually the kind of getting the money out the door in a consistent way into the community organizations, into the sort of the contracts between the multiple big organizations end up causing like the programs to be delayed. And so if you don't, there's always a fear that you have to overcome in working with communities, is that you'll come in and you'll go away, and you'll set them up to be hopeful for a better future, and then you'll disappear. And that was a sort of a problem that we ran into, being dependent on city funding. After the first year of the program, the city funding kind of dried up, and the program ended abruptly. And we were lucky because we had some funding at Columbia that we could use to continue it for after it ended. But that wasn't something that we built in at the beginning. So there has to be some kind of financial cushion. But it's just basically, you have to, if you make a promise, you have to make good on the promise. And as I think somebody said, like, financial getting paid is actually harm reduction. And so the other part is like, what would I do differently? I think at the end of the program, it's still ongoing. It's been very, very difficult to get young people into career tracks or jobs, and even for them going to college, because they run into things like, they don't have good internet access. They don't want to go on the trains because they're afraid of who they might encounter. They have to eat. A lot of this stuff is, it's if they had a mother like me, they could call up and ask for the money, and they do. And but when something goes wrong, it can easily turn into a catastrophe. And so having that kind of a cushion, having employers who will put the investment into, working with people who mightn't, check their email, and then they might miss a deadline. And that it's really a lifestyle change. And we, what I believe, I teach in a college, we get people in for 4 years plus, and we still have to, and we give them all sorts of wraparound services. We look after everything for them, and they still need our help. But after they graduate, that's not what's been given in these programs. There's like a big concern about cost effectiveness or cost benefit analysis, and it's like, how can we do this as cheaply as possible, um, and and so that's kind of what I feel, that overall mentality has to be changed. And if we want safe communities, everybody has to contribute to making them safe by giving people jobs and getting them not to have to pay the kind of fines that overwhelm poor people. So these are all the kind of things that this program was set up to do, but it's, I suppose, never enough. Okay, did you have a third part to the question?
I want to give, if you're
Another.
okay, I want to give
Yep.
Leanne the opportunity to ask one last question, and then we'll have to at least pause
Okay.
to officially wrap up. It's been so
Okay.
full of information, and I know everybody has lots of questions. Leanne, would you like to pose your question now?
Yes, thank you, Nikki. Geraldine, thank you so much for your presentation. One of the things that was illuminated for me during your talk was this idea of positive reinforcement by the community. You said some of the elderly people, when they know the young folks were getting jobs and working, they were kind of positively reinforcing that. I'm wondering if there were any other social or emotional components to the program to help to restore their integrity and their value, or help them with like trauma-related experiences.
Mm-hmm. So with the inside circle, it's interesting. At the beginning, nobody would ever go to therapy. I mean, it's like, but the inside circle, trauma healing circle, functioned as that, and so that's how they came to recognize the fact that, like, what they thought was normal was actually not, and that they had gone through these experiences, and they were dealing with them through substances, through just kind of numbing, or through being like just reactive, being angry all the time. And so that was something that was addressed, I would say, sort of indirect, well, it very effectively through the inside circle. And they've continued to come back. They had, over the course of the year, had come weekly from California, but we are still working with them. The other way that we dealt that we provided therapeutic support was the mentors and the staff, the caseworkers, and people like me, that we worked individually with people, not in a formal therapy session, but they'll call up. We'll talk them through what's going on, and so I probably would say what was really important is that many of them, or I would say most of them, if not all of them, came to the realization that they didn't have to crash out. They didn't have to catastrophize whatever was going on. That they could ask for help and get effective help. And so that was it was embedded in everything that we do, but mostly the inside circle was where they got the support.
Wonderful. I love the integration of crash out survival tips, because I do think that is going to be cross-cutting in a lot of different situations, even though every community has its own unique challenges. And I think that's one of the problems is we love to hear these success stories, and then it's a whole nother discussion to kind of try and glean what worked and why in this situation, and what's transportable, and where we can find the teaching moments. But I think you've been super, super educational for all of us. It's great to hear the good news that this worked, and it's great to be able to learn what can be replicated elsewhere. Do you have any closing remarks? We're kind of right at the hour.
Okay, no, I don't. I'm just delighted. I appreciate everybody coming on and staying on, and I and my introduction to this group, and hopefully, if you have tips, you can give them to us. This
Yeah.
this is a great group. So thank you
Th-
all. So
Thank you. And thank you to Sherston for bringing you to us. And thank you to Columbia and all of our friends in the communities of New York, and for everybody who joined for the first time. And for those of you who it's the 290 something time as well. Maria, do you have any closing words? And just so everybody knows, I post the public chat as a resource along with the slides that the professor has been using with the recording on our YouTube channel, as well as on John Jay's Dispute Resolution Center site and on the ACRGNY videos, Roundtable Breakfast videos site. So there's ample resources. We hope this is a continuing conversation, and thank you for everybody's time, attention, and knowledge sharing.
Yeah, I just want to add to everyone's accolades. Geraldine, you did a phenomenal job. We truly appreciate you joining us. To everyone, thank you so much for your patience this morning. We expected this technological glitch, didn't expect it this morning, but we knew that it was coming. We will be using a different, it won't affect you, but we will be using a more stable Zoom account link so that we won't be transitioning on the morning of a breakfast in the future. Thank you so much. Next month, we will have Najiba Saeed, who will be talking about interfaith dialogue. She has been a prominent spokesperson for interfaith work for decades. I look forward to seeing everyone then. And some of you always want to know who else is speaking. David Hoffman will be speaking in May about his new work on impasse. So look forward to seeing you next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nikki, do you have the chat saved?
Give me 1 second. Now it is saved, and I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.